Yeah, so this event is going to be recorded. It will be uploaded into our YouTube at a later date once I get it captioning set up for it. All right. So we have here with us this morning Margaret Price. Margaret Price is a professor and director of the Disability Studies program at the Ohio State University. Have to get the in there. Um, Margaret is a genderqueer femme and scholar of rhetoric, disability studies, and qualitative methods. Her book, Crip Space-Time, Access, Failure, and Accountability in Academic Life, which was published by Duke University Press in 2024, won the 2024 Allison Pipemeyer Book Prize from the National Women's Study Association, as well as an honorable mention for the Research Impact Award from the Conference on College Composition and Communication. Their first book, Mad at School, Rhetorics of Mental Disability in Academic Life, published by the University of Michigan in 2011, won the Outstanding Book Award from the Four Cs. Price is co-PI of the Transformative Access Project, and they received a 2020 Fulbright Research Award. And one last note is they are an avid knitter and an inline skater. So with that, I will turn everything over to, yes, I'll turn everything over to Margaret.
All right, fabulous. Thank you so much, Courtney. First of all, I'm going to show you some autistic slash disabled slash Zoom applause. You can do waving hands next to your face when you want to applaud if you don't feel like searching around for the little applause button. And that's also a fun way to applaud when you're in a mixed disability company or you're just in a space where you don't feel like clapping your hands together. So hello, I'm so glad to see you all. I'm truly grateful for Courtney and everyone at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County for organizing this. I was mentioning before we got started that this is one of my favorite kind of events to do. I'm really just a big teaching nerd at heart. And although I can and will get into the deep dive with theory and academic work, what I really like to do is just nerd out about what we do every day. That's my comfort zone. So this is a wonderful opportunity for me as well. Uh, Let's see, I'm going to very briefly introduce myself, and I'm also going to ask folks if they wouldn't mind putting a quick introduction of themselves in the chat. I'm kind of a Zoom native, so I'll be routinely referring to things by Zoom terms, such as the chat. And if you have any difficulty accessing the chat, please go to Courtney for access assistance with Amy as your backup. So I'm a white genderqueer femme. I'm currently in Ohio, which is the indigenous and unceded territory of peoples including the Delaware, Potawatomi, and Miami. Um, I am accompanied by my service dog Otis, who is a large black lab mix, and my distinctly unserviced and untrained cat Sam, who's currently sitting under my standing desk attachment in a fairly precarious way. If everything suddenly goes visually sideways, I'd like you to know in advance it's Sam's fault. I see some introductions coming through the chat. That's wonderful. I believe we have an hour and a half today. We're going to go until 12 p.m. my time. I think that's 2 p.m. your time. Is that right? 1 p.m. your time? Okay, and I have a half hour after that. So if people have more time and want to stick around for more talking, be aware that we don't have to just stop on the dime. I'm building in a significant amount of time for us to discuss, brainstorm, and think. For those of you who dread online breakout groups, I would like to mention that there will be no online breakout groups today. I'll talk about that more when I get to specific classroom moves, but you know, that's just a personal preference. I don't like them, so I tend not to do them. I do our time for brainstorming and discussion in different ways. A couple of logistical items before I put my slides up. I'm happy to share the slides from today's presentation as well as the advanced handout that I shared with y'all through Courtney, and also a sample assignment that I'll be talking about today. I have now unsuccessfully tried to drop those materials into the chat like 7 times. It's not going well. So Courtney, I emailed them to you. If you wouldn't mind sharing them with folks as I come to them, that would be wonderful. And the first 2 items that people should have are the advanced handout that I sent to people, which is titled Disability Studies Concepts and Principles, and the PowerPoint itself, which is titled Disability Studies Pedagogy Training Spring 2025. So as people continue to introduce themselves, I am going to go ahead and get my PowerPoint up. And the time that I spend putting that PowerPoint up can also serve as a pause. During the pause, let's take time to ask questions about logistics, get settled, and make sure we can all access this meeting. So for the next minute, I'll be bringing up the PowerPoint, and we'll also be double checking to make sure that everyone can access what they need.
So, I'm working on an email to resend out the materials.
Okay, is it possible to drop those in the chat on WebEx, or is that not a WebEx thing?
I don't know if that's a WebEx thing.
Okay, yeah, it certainly didn't like
Yeah,
me
no,
to.
it doesn't like you to do documents like that.
Didn't want me to do that. I'm going to go ahead and get started. This will involve going to a handout called Disability Studies Concepts and Principles, which I will put up on the screen. So if you don't have it at your fingertips right now, don't worry.
Courtney,
So
you can also make it a Google Doc and share it in the chat. Sorry, Margaret.
Oh, you're so smart.
Why they pay me, not the.
So one thing that happens when I share my full screen with a slide is I can no longer typically see the meeting I'm in. Do we look good to move forward, Amy? All right, great. So this workshop that we're doing together today is sort of a cousin of the disability studies pedagogy training that I offer at Ohio State. At Ohio State, I sort of am alone the disability studies program. There are many, many wonderful faculty and graduate students and undergraduate students working in disability studies scattered literally across one of the largest universities in the world. So the hub is in the English department, and it's essentially me and one program associate. So we're sort of tiny dots at the center of a very large, diffuse, I'm trying not to say hurricane. Hurricane. And this is one reason why I offer a very interdisciplinary style of DS pedagogy training. It's because we don't have a set curriculum and we don't have a course structure that students go through in order. We have lots of different classes from many different colleges that all contribute to various people's ways of applying disability studies. It sounds like that's a good fit for Maryland, Baltimore County as well, where disability studies is sort of coming in different directions and from different disciplines. On the cover slide is a picture from one of my graduate classrooms a couple of years ago. The students in the foreground and background are mostly wearing masks, and we are all doing an accessible activity designed by one of the students that involves trying to create our dream accessible bathroom using an architectural tool known as the sandbox. The sandbox in design and architecture is often presented as a literal sandbox. And it has little things in it like figurines, structures, shapes, directional signage. And so we're doing a group project together that allows students to manipulate these elements and collaborate and work together to try to talk about what would an accessible space with the specific purpose of a bathroom be like? I like this picture because it shows a number of different things, particularly the way that in accessible classrooms that I'm working in, a lot of the content is student generated. I'm kind of an old English professor. I am not as cool as my students. I'm certainly not doing as many groovy, innovative projects as they are. I don't have access to the same kinds of tools or knowledge of platforms. So my learning in the classroom tends to be very participatory and very collaborative. I also tend to start from simple principles like design an accessible activity for our class. And then that takes a long time because we have to think about things like, what does accessible mean? What is an appropriate activity for this specific class? How do I, thinking from the point of view of a student, work from the point of view as an instructor or a facilitator? And how do I take everyone's individual access needs into account? Also on this slide is the link to my personal website, which is just margaretprice.wordpress.com. I'll be referring to that website periodically as we go along because it offers different resources. The first thing we're going to do today is just get oriented together. We already did that. Yay. Everyone introduce themselves in the chat. Thank you. And I now want to talk about a few principles of disability studies. Again, Courtney sent this out to pre-registrants ahead of time, and I'll go over each of those principles in detail now. The reason that I use these principles, and I'm about to share them, is because when I first started teaching disability studies, I realized that there were particular things we would get stuck on early and that we were not sharing together conceptually. So as a discipline, disability studies is very large, very capacious. It contains lots of controversies and different points of view. But there are a few things for me as a disability studies scholar and teacher that I want to just start from. So I've started just kind of unashamedly claiming these as our starting principles when I give disability studies pedagogy trainings. And this is particularly true when I'm training people to teach in the program that I direct. So for example, there are certain ethical commitments that I make as a trainer of instructors, and certain things that I just want to make transparent to the instructors I work with, saying, these are the things that I want our program to be grounded in. If any of these feel really inimical to you, like something you really can't get on board with, I want you to know what they are up front so that we can figure out what to do about that. I also started doing this because I discovered that after several years of teaching, and especially when a lot of our curriculum went online in 2020, I discovered that people who were teaching disability studies classes at Ohio State were doing some things that most disability studies scholars would at least raise an eyebrow at, if not directly advise against. So I found out, for example, that one instructor had centered their class around interviews of disabled people. Like the assignment was go out, find a disabled person of any description, and interview them about what it's like to be disabled. Now, if that assignment had been grounded in a particular methodological framework or a particular disciplinary purpose, like we're doing ethnographic interviewing and we want to learn more about experiences, or we are in an engineering class and we are interested specifically in what it's like to be a person with a disability and also designing adaptive equipment, that would have made more sense to me. But an assignment that was like essentially asking students to stick a microphone at someone and be like, what's it like to be disabled? I was like, oh, I'm not communicating well as a facilitator. Let's do this differently. So I'm going to quickly go over these principles as I've articulated them, and then I'm going to pause and go back to our WebEx chat and ask people for questions and comments. First, I want to double check with Amy. We're looking at the list on my shared screen right now, right? Okay, great. So here are the key principles that I ask instructors to kind of take on and consider seriously in the design of their classes. First, there's no set rule for language and disability. Some people will tell you language must always be person first, that is, person with a disability. Some people may say you should not use a term like midget or cripple. The fact is, this is wildly variable between communities, between disciplines, and as a rhetorician, I always say, between audiences and purposes. The one thing that's off the table always and forever in any classroom I teach is slurs. We do not use slurs casually. We do not articulate them unless there's a good reason for doing so. And if someone is going to articulate a slur, I ask them to give a content warning first. And unless we're researching slurs specifically, which we have done in my classroom, we typically just consider them instruments of harm. Otherwise, as long as people can account for their language and their choices around it, I do not call it right or wrong. So, for example, I use the term disabled with ease. I call myself a disabled person. I refer to other people as disabled. To me, that's a neutral term. But I also want to flag that when I'm teaching and flag it first on this list, because when some people hear that, it immediately gives them a painful reaction. Center the perspectives, voices, and work of disabled people. This does not mean centering those who are related to or friends with disabled people, much as we might love those folks. So another common thing I sometimes see among new instructors is they will be really interested in material that reports on disabled people rather than material that is generated by the disabled people. So we'll see work by scientists or writers saying, here's my experience with my mother with dementia, or here's my experience as a doctor who has no disabilities but has worked extensively with cancer patients. That work is important, but it's also important to recognize that it is coming from a different place than work generated by, authored by, created by, co-authored with people with disabilities. And so I ask instructors to just be cognizant of that when constructing their syllabi. Very important, do not identify disabled people as pitiable, wondrous, in need of fixing, inspirational, suffering, or possessive special talents because of their disabilities. This is typically something that I find more often among students than the instructors I work with. And certain dominant cultural tropes, such as the trope of the autistic savant, the trope of the wondrous or inspirational girl with Down syndrome who finally got to go to the prom. These stories can be very compelling and very popular. So part of my work is to work with students unpacking those stories and saying, why are we marveling at a 17-year-old girl going to the prom? Why is the football player who brought her to prom in the middle of the picture? Questions like that. But one thing that is really interesting about teaching disability studies is we often become more aware of the cultural tropes that we ourselves are participating in. It's always important to assume that there are disabled people in the classroom, working as your colleagues, giving your workshops like me, among your friends and family. Linguistic habit that folks sometimes have is to refer to disabled people as them and everyone else as us. So for example, it's really important to design accessible equipment because they need it. So again, this is kind of a mindfulness thing. Like, what pronouns are coming out when you talk about disability? Where are those pronouns locating different people? It's also important at the same time to be aware that not everyone I, Margaret, might think of or clock as disabled would themselves say they are disabled. There are so many different ways of being in the world, and something that I might think is sort of obviously a disability, another person might identify differently. A note about disclosure. Often in a classroom that centers disability or disability perspectives, students whose lives intersect with disability in some way will feel sort of like a floodgate opened. They may disclose a lot to you. They may be excited to talk about disability, their own, something in their family, something among their friends. Be aware that even if this is coming to you in a very open and forthright way, that still might be pretty sensitive material to the person who's talking about it. So remember that if someone has disclosed something to you, they disclose to you. And unless you had an explicit conversation about where else that information might go, it's best to check first about that. This can be particularly interesting with regard to disability, which is like some other identities like queerness, sometimes profession or other things that are not taken for granted by families of origin. Sorry, I have to close my door. If one's upbringing or family of origin doesn't reflect an identity that later becomes very, very important, there can be this effect of feeling like, I found my people, when you're first in a class that's really centering that question. And again, that could lead to a lot of sort of openness or disclosure, a lot of interest in a topic, a lot of excitement about kind of throwing oneself into the topic. But you, as the instructor, remember, you're the steady point in this journey of discovery that some of your students might be on. So you're the person saying, I'm not going to repeat that. I'm not going to assume anything tomorrow about what you said today. You know, I'm the steady point for you if you do happen to be going on kind of an identity journey around the issue of disability. That doesn't happen for everybody, but it does occasionally happen, and it's worth noting that it can be an emotionally vulnerable topic for some folks. So it's best to just be respectful, direct, and as always, transparent about what you're taking in and what you think is going to go public. An interesting thing that is especially important in disability studies scholarship of the last 10 years, 15 years or so, is a push against the white-centric nature of disability studies work. A good first read on this topic is the essay Introducing White Disability Studies by Christopher Bell. And since then, there have been literally scores or hundreds of wonderful follow-up work bringing together critical race studies and disability studies, or as it's briefly known, DisCrit. Another wonderful open access resource I would recommend is the Disability Justice Primer from the movement, the organization Sins Invalid, which is located within the disability justice movement. Two other quick notes. These are more practical. First of all, try to resist the impulse to think of access as something you fix or achieve. Tragically, it's not. I wish it were, because I'm a Virgo and I'm a very controlling person. Nothing would make me happier than to be able to simply fix an access problem and have it stay fixed. That's just not how access works. It's built through relationships, it's built through care, it's built through changing circumstances. At the same time, individual accommodations are important. Accommodations in higher education are framed as individual fixes. For example, this student needs more time to complete a test, therefore they will get extra time on the test. Be very respectful of those. Whoever has those accommodations probably had to fight really hard to get them. So at the same time that I think accommodations are conceptually flawed, I always apply them and I always invite students to share their access needs. Finally, those of you who have studied disability studies a bit may be familiar with the concept of models. For example, the social model of disability, the medical model, the cultural model. My friend David Bolt just came out with a new book that introduces the playground model. I don't know what that is yet. I'm interested to find out. I don't usually focus on models really closely because I think they may in some ways have outrun their usefulness in disability studies. However, they're a good starting point. The main thing I tell instructors about models of disability when I'm training instructors is, please understand this is not the be all and end all of disability studies. If you're familiar with the social model, that's great. But please don't assume that gives you the key and answer to all things disability studies. There's a lot more happening. All right, so those are my basic principles. And here I'm going to introduce a pause and ask if people have questions or comments. Feel free to put a question in the chat or just to raise your hand, and either Amy or Courtney will call on you.
I have a question, Margaret.
Yeah.
As we're talking through this, and I was thinking of this workshop as helping faculty be familiar with the field and with norms and practices. But how much of this do you share with your students, and how much do they participate in kind of you talked about learning from your students, participate in maybe being up to date with some of the thinking about how to include people and how to feel inclusive?
A lot. So I don't recall the last time I shared this specific list with students, but every one of these principles is incorporated into a syllabus that I will teach from. So for example, right now, in one of my classes, I'm directly teaching the concept of discrit. I'm holding up the cover of one of the early anthologies in discrit. And we're talking about sort of digging into those questions of what is the history of the white-centric perspectives in disability studies? When and how did that arise historically? What are some of the ways that the disability movement was intertwined with the civil rights movement in the US? And also importantly, what are some of the myths that white disabled people like to tell about the civil rights movement and how it intertwined with the disability movement? That's in some ways a bit of a troubled history. And so that's something that's worth doing a historical close look at. In terms of questions like language, for that, I absolutely rely on students to bring their own perspectives into how that might work. Not only because most of my students are younger than me at this point, but also because my students come from all over the world and all kinds of different backgrounds. So right now, for example, I'm working with a graduate student who pointed out to me that in her home country, there's no direct translation for the English word disability. What I might refer to as a disabled person would be the literal translation into Farsi would be person of distinction. And we are kind of wrestling with what that mean. How does that translate for us culturally? I see a question from Lindsay Johnson that I'm going to read out loud. Could you talk a bit more about access issues and how they can't be fixed? Could you give an example? I too am a Virgo, woot, and want to share that tendency to want to fix something and have it stay fixed. This is a great question. I'm going to show you the cover of my book. I'll be talking about this a little bit when I get to specific classroom moves, but I'm holding up the cover of my book, which is called Crip Spacetime. And the subtitle is Access, Failure, and Accountability in Academic Life. In a sense, this whole book is a way of trying to explain why it's not simple to quote unquote fix an access issue. On its face, especially if it's in my own classroom, an access issue might look like something I can address pretty directly. For example, one of my students has grand mal seizures and cannot safely be under fluorescent light. The answer is turn the lights off. Don't use the fluorescent lights. So in that sense, things can often be fixed immediately. And we're all sort of doing little access fixes throughout our day. Oh, let me move that chair out of the way. Um, oh, I need my service dog Otis to fit in a crowded classroom. We have to reconfigure it a little bit. And then sometimes access needs get a little bit more complex or there's some friction involved. Otis is with me in the classroom, but there's also a student who has significant generational trauma around dogs, especially large dogs. This student does not feel safe with a dog in the room. How are we going to navigate that? That's part of the process I'm referring to. And then there also sometimes are things where you can tell it's an infrastructural problem, but the answer is not in front of you. Some of the classrooms I teach in are windowless and only lit by fluorescent light. I can't turn the lights off unless we're going to operate in complete darkness. That's an interesting idea for the classroom. Uh-oh, now someone in the classroom is deaf and working with an interpreter. They have to see their interpreter. We can't safely use the lights. What are we going to do? Now, I'm married to an engineer and I run around with engineers a lot. So I know that every access problem often looks like it's fixable. And this is especially funny if you're working with solution-oriented people like Virgos and engineers. They'll be like, well, move to a different classroom, use a flashlight, put the interpreter in the hallway. Like the urge to solve is so strong. And a lot of what I'm talking about in the book Crypt Space Time is, yes, there are tons and tons of access issues we can solve. Some of them we can even solve and just be done with occasionally. But let's notice that trying to think about access in a fast moving and high stakes environment like higher education is, in a sense, always a problem. It's always getting in the way. And accommodations themselves are by nature an attempt to fix a problem that already happened. That phenomenon is known as the retrofit. A scholar named Jay Dolmage has written about this really beautifully in his book, Academic Ableism. I write about it in Crypt Space Time. The scholar Remy Urgo has written about this. Accommodations by nature are attempting to address a problem that we already have with the environment. They're not typically forward-looking. They're not designed in the way that a universal design device would be, for example, trying to make the environment itself more accessible. Another interesting thing about accommodations, and this is one of my key points in Crypt Space Time, is it also has to be a prediction. You cannot have an accommodation in higher education unless you are able to say, I know what my access problem is, number one. I know what I need to fix it, number two. And number three, this is the time element, I can tell you when I'm going to need that fix. So I will need a sign interpreter in the classroom next Tuesday at 10:30 a.m. That's a typical accommodation. Accommodations, again, this is largely in American higher education, are always predictions. And therefore, they are always subject to failure, or as Dolmage calls them, defeat devices. Defeat devices. Sorry, that was a very long answer to your question. I'm not going to go on at that much length because I know we don't have that much time today, but that was a really key central point for how disability studies and accessible pedagogy work. Is it's not a matter of a checklist or things we can put in place and just let roll. It's unfortunately or fortunately much more contextual and much more critically oriented than that. Now, I want to move to the next thing, which is just brainstorming some ideas for your own syllabi. So let's make this a 5-minute brainstorming session during which people can also put follow-up questions in the chat. I'm going to share my screen again just briefly. WebEx stuff all over my slide. Okay. um, so here I want to kind of seize and make use of whatever's rolling in your mind right now. Let's take 5 minutes for you to write on your own. You can talk into your phone, write, move around, draw, whatever is your brainstorming technique. How might you apply some of this to your own syllabus? I'm assuming the syllabi from folks in this workshop are along a whole range of disciplines. Think about your circumstances, big lecture courses, small discussion courses, critical thinking. You need to learn how to stitch somebody up in 4 minutes, and that is not negotiable. Think about your classroom and take 5 minutes to brainstorm topic or approaches for your syllabus. And I have a few generative ideas here, but feel free to go in your own direction. You could consider, and here I'm reading directly off the slide, histories, spaces, cultures, identities, media, politics. Or if you'd like to hone in on ideas, you might think about ideas such as pity, inspiration, beauty, fitness, wellness, safety, diversity. Sorry, some of the laws in Ohio are pissing us all off right now. So I'm going to just time us for 5 minutes of silent brainstorming. And again, if you have overflowing questions, just keep dropping them in the chat and we'll come back after 5 minutes. This is Margaret again. We have 2 more minutes. Continue to just brainstorm your ideas and or put questions in the chat as needed. Hi again, this is Margaret. Uh, just checking the chat. Some of the questions are really great material for follow-up conversations at UMBC. Drew, of course, I'm looking at you to help be the leader of some of those questions and how they might continue to be taken up. And all right. So hopefully that was a good moment to just think about how you might teach. I'd like to just take a minute here and ask, shifting off the questions for Margaret tip for a minute, could anyone share with me inspirations they've had for their own classes? What's a topic or idea that you wrote down during the brainstorm?
I have one, even though I don't have a syllabus, but it's something I've been thinking of
Yeah.
lately. I've been thinking a lot since it's spooky season.
Ooh,
I've been thinking a lot about um, representation of disability in horror films, and that so that would be like I think something that would be of interest to students.
yes.
There's a lot there to mull over. I think
Here, oh, go ahead, please finish.
no. I was gonna say Maria is next, but you can
Oh,
follow up.
a documentary that I love teaching is Code of the Freaks. It's about representations of disability in film. Some of it is a little Gen X coded because the film I think is 8 or 9 years old by now. But it's so good. And then Courtney, you were going to call on the next person.
Maria Cietti. Maria, did you have a question?
Yes, can folks hear me? Because I'm not using my laptop, so it's not connected to WebEx in the traditional way. Yes?
I
Yes, we
can
can
hear
hear
you
you.
now.
Okay, great. So right now, so I'm in gender, women's, and sexuality studies, which I think intersects really well with an interdisciplinary field such as disability studies, but our department lacks uh the proper representation. So that it warrants, and I know that that's a big gap in our curriculum. So I just wanted to make a note of that. I teach a few classes. I teach an upper division methods course, like feminist methodologies, and it's a course I teach every semester. So I'm always thinking of how to like revamp it and change it. We just finished. I think it can be. There's so many things that can be intersected, but I'm thinking even like in like archival exercises, like giving folks different historical documents for them to start to track changes in like terminology or policy. We're always talking about how um, doing archival work is both really important, but also archives trace uh structural violences and they're sometimes really hard to do archival work if you're confronted with structures and histories that have been harmful to you, people, your community, or other people. And so we've been talking a lot about like using the senses, like how can we make archival work sensorial? And I think that would really work really well in also thinking about the connections with disability studies. So I'm gonna make notes of that and see how to incorporate it in a way that feels ripping the archive. Thank you. Also, this talk has been
Fabulous.
really helpful, so thank you for that.
Yeah, I'm another reason I love workshops is I overflow with ideas, which is not always a generative stance with my own students in a classroom. So this is like me getting to let loose. Drew, will you say a little bit about your work with Ansel Dua and deaf education identity?
Yes.
You're
Hello, can you all?
welcome.
Hi, I'm Drew Holiday. I'm a middle-aged white man with dark hair and a beard with some age showing on the corner, with some gray hair. So I put this in the chat, but I teach this essay, How to Tame a Wild Tongue by Gloria Anzaldúa, that talks about sort of how looking at English and Spanish as separate languages and separate boxes like doesn't really reflect how language works, and it also can be used against vulnerable and marginalized communities. So we first talk about like the difference between language as an abstract system and language as something that's lived and generated in communities, and then we the kind of key, the student hook for this is that you tell them about Alexander Graham Bell and how he was horrible, in the sense that he, in most of this history isn't known to most people, but he was a very vociferous advocate, to the point of writing pretty much a book to Congress about why deaf people should not be able to marry, because that will create more deaf people. And he saw that as a eugenic social problem. But the example I give is, thinking about schools that were built with the explicit idea that deaf children needed to speak like hearing people, and that sign language was a bad thing, that would it was a regression that would hurt their education. And so students weren't allowed to use sign language in the classroom in these schools. But outside of the classroom, the students created their own kind of like ad hoc sign language in different spaces that was not standardized, but still kind of served the purposes of the community. So I'll stop there.
Perfect, thank you. And in the interest of time, I'm not actually going to go over every amazing idea I'm seeing in the chat. I'm so glad this workshop is being recorded, and I definitely hope that y'all are able to come back to these ideas, draw on the disability studies and pedagogical communities you already have, and go back into these. Like, this is very corny. I'm a very corny kind of teacher and leader. You are the riches. Like, these ideas are already here. So a lot of my job is to help this conversation continue, as opposed to just dropping wisdom nonstop, which of course I also do. I've asked one person to explain what they mean by crip face. I'm really interested to learn more from Lindsay about music. That's amazing. That's an area I teach in not at all. I see there's already responses, book history, adaptive technology. Okay, yes, we're not going to stop here, but if we do a follow-up workshop, this is an example of how I would be learning from my students about stuff that I have no knowledge of and I'm not an expert in. It's such a rich area for exploration. The next three things that we're going to be doing together in this workshop are looking closely at an assignment. We're actually not going to look at it that closely because it's super long, and I want to make sure we get to what I call sticky questions in the classroom. And then no matter what, I will be leaving time at the end so that we have an opportunity, all of us, to take a little more quiet brainstorming time and have one final discussion and kind of action items for where we want to launch from here. We will be doing that wrap up within 35 minutes, but again, I'll be available for another 30 minutes after that in case people want to linger. So let's go to the assignment. I briefly forgot how to read the word share. Now I'm good. Where we are now is an example of an assignment that I do soup to nuts. Now, the handout, Mapping Disability Studies, is available to you. And I'm actually just going to skip the second bullet point here where I would be going over the assignment, quote unquote, briefly. It's a long assignment. And that's going to bring me directly to some pros and cons of the ways that I do assignments in classrooms that I'm attempting to teach accessibly, whether they're disability studies topic on the disability studies topic or not. I always use our class site as a shared archive. So the learning management system that we use at Ohio State is Canvas. And when I set up my Canvas site for each class, I explicitly set it up as a shared archive of learning. It's not just a delivery system. So I use various Canvas features like pages and discussions to build knowledge together. And I am constantly telling students, this is us building knowledge together. This is stuff that I want you to treat as an archive. So for example, we all take notes collaboratively during every class. Those are stored together in our shared archive. We make commitments to each other at the beginning of the semester about how we will learn together. Those go in our shared archive. We have an agenda for every class. We have links out to materials, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that helps set the stage for a really long assignment like mapping disability studies. Again, I'm a rhetorician, so part of what you're getting here is just the front loading of rhetoric in the way that I teach. What is the purpose? Who is the audience? What are the things you have to do? What are the things you might do? What's the calendar? What are some examples you might look at? That's all in the single assignment document. And that brings me to a pro of doing assignments this way, which is that it forces me and students to slow down. We go over this assignment once together when I'm introducing the assignment. It takes a long time because it's a long assignment. We treat it as an artifact in the class itself. It's an artifact that students are interpreting, they're brainstorming off of it, they're making plans together. And then while we're carrying out the assignment, there are multiple iterations of a workshop that we do along the way where students are getting feedback and we always return to the assignment. Are we remembering the objectives? Are we remembering the audience? Often students will discover something weird in my directions that is not going to work. With this exact assignment, which I'm teaching right now, I initially had the requirement must fit on one screen. Courteously, on the day I introduced it, a student raised their hand and said, Dr. Price, this is a minimum of 1,000 words, right? And I was like, yes. And they said, and you want it on one screen? I said, yes. Oh, students at Ohio State tend to be relatively shy. They will rarely be like, that's stupid. You know, what are you doing? And so we went on and we taught for a while, and then it slowly dawned on me, that's going to be unreadable. That's going to be so tiny. So we modified the assignment together so that it has to be a single PDF, but it can be something that the user zooms around on. So that's an example of why my assignments are long. I want them to serve as an archive that we work with. And also ways that students will give feedback while we're working with things and be like, this is working, this isn't working, can I modify in the following way? And the other thing that is happening with the assignment mapping disability studies is it's doing a few things at once, both in terms of disability studies pedagogy, but also in terms of accessible pedagogy. First, it's just a concept map. Those of you who have taught concept maps or knowledge maps before, that's all this assignment is. At heart, it's the genre concept map. Take some concept or piece of knowledge and render it in some form of a map. Now, in this particular assignment, I'm encouraging students to have fun with the notion of what a map could be. It could be a drawing. It could be a geographical map. It could be a flow chart, a diagram. It could be a list of written directions in bullet form. If this is a person who sees things in a linear and textual fashion, to my mind, that's a map too. So the assignment is always multimodal in the way that students are delivering it. I also, after experimenting with this assignment a lot, I decided to say, use any platform you want. Now, if I'm teaching a large class, and as a humanities professor, for me, large means 50 or 60 students, a lecture style class, there I might say, you have to use the following platform. Like you have to use Padlet, or you have to use Miro, or, whatever platform I've decided will A, work best for the class's purposes, and B, OSU will let me use. This particular class, I left the platform open and said, I happen to have a bunch of design students in this class, and I was like, show me what you can do with this platform. It needs to come out the other end as a PDF, so no videos, maybe an interpretive dance, but you're going to have to explain to me how you'll render that. Use any platform you like, and what I want you to turn in is a PDF. Now, this assignment is happening relatively early in the semester. It's happening now. So the assignment also says explicitly, do not worry about things like creating an accessible PDF. Don't worry about subheads, alt tags. Don't worry about optical character recognition. There's a lot of technical things that go into document design or artifact design that we will be doing in the final project. For that project, students will be creating accessible videos, including custom designed captions and image descriptions. For this early assignment, I really want them to think about access not as a technical process, but as something where they need to consider, again, audience and purpose. And that's why I specified that the audience is members of our class. By the time we get to this point in the semester, we've already worked out what kind of access people need for documents. And so we're not trying to imagine any audience in the entire world, and we're trying to apply universal design for any possible user. This early assignment is kind of a micro exercise in access where I'm saying, think about this class. You know how we operate. We know we describe images. We know that we can share PDFs that don't use optical character recognition, whatever the parameters are we have in the class. Just apply those. Use your own platform. And the two goals that I have in saying open platform and design it for us, the class, are I want students to feel free to play, to really think about how might I grapple with this concept in a graphical interface. And second, I want them to start thinking about access without getting over concerned about how to technically execute the kinds of access they're imagining. Technical execution of access is difficult. It's a specialization in and of itself. And sometimes I need to ask for help from our IT team. Like a student wants to do XYZ or 3D print this thing. That's outside my capability. How do we execute that? So this early assignment is really aimed at imagining access and not having to worry too much yet about, oh, but is that going to work with Python markup? So that's my goal with mapping disability studies. I'm going to unshare this slide now and just ask briefly if there are any questions about how I'm using this assignment or why I position it as an early assignment in a disability studies class. Any questions about the mapping access or mapping disability studies assignment? And to be clear, this is not meant as like the world's best assignments. This is just me saying, here's how I would introduce the question of access relatively early in the semester. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move on to what I call sticky situations, and then we'll have another opportunity to chat. Oh, sorry, one question, most surprising submissions. The most surprising submission I've ever gotten comes immediately to mind, which was a series of dyed cloths. So I was teaching the concept map in a graduate seminar. It was Introduction to Disability Studies for Graduate Studies. Um, and you know, the early assignment was concept map, and the later assignment was design an accessible activity. The one that, the one that is pictured on the cover slide. So we were working on our concept maps. I think I change the topic of the concept map quite often. The assignment that you have in hand is please map your understanding of the field of disability studies. Sometimes I'll say, please map your understanding of disability itself, or please map a particular skill that you have or a concept you know. You know, you can sort of put anything at the conceptual center of this assignment. But for the particular one I'm thinking of, I believe I said, please map disability itself as a concept. And one of the students is a student in art and design. And she said, I know you said you wanted our maps to be generated at the end as PDFs, but you also said we could talk to you about possible alternatives. And I said, sure. And she said, I am a fiber artist. I do my own weaving and dyeing. And I understand disability is highly interactive. Can I work on this with my son? Her son is autistic, and a lot of her sort of knowledge of disability is built through that relation. She said, I would like to do a project with my son, and it would culminate in a series of hand-dyed woven pieces of fabric, and then I would present them to the class. Now, I am far from a perfect person, and my initial internal reaction to this was kind of sounds like maybe the student wants to pull out some stuff she already did. And I managed to suppress that initial reaction and say, yes, let's try that. Okay, let's see what happens. And it turned out to be extraordinary. She did indeed do a dedicated project. My suspicions were completely unfounded. She reported in regularly to the class during feedback sessions about what she and her son were thinking of and conceptualizing and how they were building relations through the weaving they were making, and especially how were they going to capture that knowledge building, which is always a question for her as a visual and fiber artist. And I think that the fact that she was doing this project, not only doing the project, but routinely sharing with the whole class what she was working on, really freed up the rest of the class to get kind of wild in their accessible activities. Often when I assign the accessible activity, what happens is kind of a series of craft projects or a series of discussions, which is fine. Those need to be accessible. Those are actually kind of the meat and potatoes of how a lot of us teach, is lectures, discussions, and hands-on activities. But in that particular class, I think all of us were loosened up and met with a sense of new possibilities, because this student said to me, I want to try a different format. Can I? And I managed to say, I will trust you. Okay, I want to go on to sticky situations because there are many in teaching, and then we're going to go to our brainstorming and final discussion. Okay, so the next thing that I want to talk about is the issue of potential sticky questions. There are almost endless sticky, problematic, difficult, hard to resolve, interesting questions when attempting to teach accessibly and or teaching the subject of disability studies. And two that I want to focus on particularly are presence and pacing. So I'll go over each of these relatively briefly, and then again, we'll come back to discuss. So ever since I wrote my first book, Mad at School, which was published in 2011, I have been very troubled by the question of presence in the classroom. Not only do we typically grade, or I'll speak for myself, I typically grade students for attending class, which feels really uncomfortable, perhaps more uncomfortable by the year in this time of increasing precarity, illness, and inequity. And I also, up until some years ago, used to assign a grade for something I called participation. I did that because I was taught to. When I was trained as a brand new writing instructor, I was just told participation is usually 15% of the grade, just put it on there. And I did that without thinking for years and years, even decades. While I was writing Mad at School, I started it in about 2008. So it contains some interesting anachronisms about, especially about virtual teaching. But anyway, please overlook those. I really thought deeply while writing this book about what presence and participation mean. Why do we grade people on being physically in a classroom or not? Why do we grade them on things like whether their camera is on or not, or whether they're verbally, orally asking questions or not? How are students responding to these standards so that they learn to signal presence or signal participation to avoid being penalized or avoid being openly shamed in the classroom? Why do I, Margaret, get so frustrated when I walk to the back of the classroom when I'm teaching 60 students at once and discovering that every single one of the students in the back 2 rows is doing homework for a different class? What effects does this have on our learning? And very importantly, when are these external motivators like grades, feeling like you really want to stay with the class, feeling like you don't want to let the teacher down or let your grade down or let someone else down, when are those kinds of external motivators actually positive? I just said to a class I'm teaching yesterday, I would do nothing without a deadline. If you didn't give me a deadline, I wouldn't be employed. I have to have external motivation to get things done. I know that some sense of urgency is necessary, but where is the line of harm in the external motivation that we offer our students to be present and participating? So I'm constantly experimenting and tinkering with this. One thing that I've come to recently is a point-based system of attendance. I set up the semester so that it's out of 100 points, or, 200 or 300, whatever multiple of 100 fits with the way I'm designing our work. I figure out the exact number of times class is going to meet. I assign a certain number of points to each class, and every time a student attends class, they earn those points. Now, this is simply a reverse way of taking points, quote unquote, off for not being present. But it is an important psychological switch for me, and I think possibly for students as well. The point of being present is to earn, gain, achieve knowledge in the class. It's to pass certain milestones. It's not to get kicked every time you're not there. So that's one shift I make is we are building points as we are more often present for each other. We are not losing them as we do not attend class. Again, purely a semantic distinction, not a mathematical distinction. And the other thing I do that is a more radical change is students can earn back the points that they lose if they don't attend class. This one has required a lot of tinkering. Basically, the system is, since my class is built as an archive and students have abundant notes from class, handouts, materials, reading logs, they have all kinds of stuff to draw on when a class has taken place. If they are absent from a class, they must review all that material and write me a 250 word summary / reflection of what went on in class. There's also a little kind of cover my ass statement in my syllabus saying, you can't do this for every class. Like, this is not me changing it into an online class that operates asynchronously for you alone. First of all, that's against the rules at OSU. And second of all, that's just, I'm not capable of teaching a class where everybody's doing their own thing. So I have this kind of fail-safe built into the syllabus that says essentially, if you've done this about 3 times in the course of a twice-a-week class during the semester, I will ask you for an individual conference and we're going to figure out something else. Like, you can't do this indefinitely. But for a relatively typical, for a middle of the curve number of absences, which for a twice-a-week class for many undergraduates at Ohio State tends to fall somewhere between 3 and 5, that's a usable tool to earn back their presence points. And I wondered when I started doing it, is everybody just going to do this without fail and always earn back their presence points? Interestingly, no. I still have a wide grade distribution at the end of the semester. So far it seems to be working for generating, I think, a sufficient amount of external motivation without also just inequitably penalizing students who really are going to miss 5 classes in the course of a semester and can't afford to miss those 20 points or 10 points or whatever it would be. The second sticky issue is pacing. Always a really hard question, regardless of what kind of class you're teaching or how many students you're teaching. Faster, slower, time to degree, stop the clock. Higher education runs on these tropes of time. A rhetorician would say these tropes of chronos, and kairos, which is another kind of time in rhetoric. So I do various things to try to slow down the class, but also speed it up when certain people might need it speeded up, and to pause when we need to pause. One of the measures that I use is to offer extensions to everyone across the board, regardless of whether they're registered with disability services or not. Everyone can have an extension for any assignment unless it's an assignment that affects their peers in the classroom. So group work, no, you do not get an extension. Something we're workshopping, no. But if it's like a reading log or the last iteration of a major project that we've all been working on together for a month, typically I have no reason not to extend that deadline. And the learning environment of the classroom also doesn't need that work done in a particular time frame. So my policy is anyone can have an extension for one of the permitted assignments, and you have to do 2 things to achieve that extension. First, you must notify me in writing. I ask them to use the inbox tool on Canvas because that way I can see all my pedagogical mail at the same time. And second, you must tell me what your new due date is. This is me trying to remove the typical question, can I have an extension? That sets me up as like sort of the goddess of the classroom, which obviously is flattering, but I'm not trying to teach people that I'm the goddess in charge of their time. I'm trying to teach them that in a professional world, sometimes they're going to have a conversation about time. And this is how you do it. You notify someone, you notify them professionally, you let them know what a feasible time frame is. It also removes the implicit requirement that people tell you why they need an extension, which I think is just awkward for everyone. People are welcome to tell me their personal circumstances if they want to, but they don't have to. I do impose a 30-day limit from the original due date of the assignment. That's to help people not do everything at the end of the semester. I also personally would not like that, so I'm just saving us all from that. There's a rolling extension limit 30 days out from an assignment. And then when the end of the semester comes, deadlines are 30 days from the 30 days from the due date or December 11th, whichever is earlier. I also pause a lot. I'll introduce short pauses as I did during this workshop for reflection, brainstorming, just breathing, going to the bathroom. In a 3-hour-long seminar, for example, we typically don't have one long 15-minute break in the middle. We have at least 2 breaks of 10 minutes. And then we also have lots of micro pauses along the way. That's especially helpful if you're working with people who are working with sign interpreters, reading captions, maybe at the absolute top of their cognitive processing level, just a minute of silence, pausing, pulling ourselves together is very helpful. I also build in pauses on my syllabus. I open up 1 or 2 weeks during the semester, which are just for whatever needs to flow in there. Usually it's catching up. Occasionally it's going back to something we didn't spend enough time on. Sometimes it's just taking a break. Hey, everything is horrible. It's November. Let's take a day off. And as both of these strategies indicate, I'm always approaching time rhetorically. The point is not everyone should get extra time because that's just the right thing to do. I mean, it is, but that's not the world we live in. Time works according to the purpose and the audience. If I were teaching EMTs to do their work, it would be a different kind of requirement around time. Sometimes you have to know how to do a task from memory in a certain time frame, and you have to be excellent. That's just how certain rhetorical situations work. However, if you're working on a concept map and you're dyeing fabric and you're turning in the final product, that's a different rhetorical situation. Speaking of pauses, I'm going to invite everyone to take 30 seconds to move, breathe. Let's remember we are in bodies, and then we'll come back for discussion. So 30 seconds for movement, then we'll come back. Hey, buddy, how you doing? Thank you for also stretching. All right, that's an example of a micro pause, and that's about how long it often is in the classroom. We are now at the final part of our agenda. I want to encourage people to be writing down action items for yourself or notes that you want to pursue. And I'm going to put that prompt in the chat. So feel free to use this 7 minutes that we have remaining to just take that as time for yourself to do planning. We can also use this 7 minutes for discussion and questions. What questions are coming up? What would people like to talk about a little bit more? What are some final discussion items or questions we might engage together? Thanks, Drew. Would you mind reading your question out loud?
Yeah, sure. How might faculty in STEM, for instance, explain disability studies pedagogy principles to colleagues, implication colleagues that are very suspicious of these ideas?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really important question. And those are conversations that as disability studies director, I have a lot. Occasionally when I'm talking to people about disability studies and it's unfamiliar to them, I am met with what I might imagine as being somewhat dismissive or contemptuous. For example, people might say, that seems soft, or I bet you get a lot of fakers. You know, if we make it this easy on students, they won't know how to operate in the real world. You know, what if someone needs to fly a plane? And one of the things that's really on me and really important for my own practice as not only a teacher myself, but as someone who trains teachers, is to just try not to be shitty about that. Like, even if maybe someone is being a little snarky or dismissive, to try to meet that with genuine interest, because there's pretty much always a valid issue or concern underneath a point that someone is making, like, hey, you know, I'm teaching nurses. Like, they are going to be overwhelmed. They have to do it fast and they have to get it right. Like, why are you why are you telling me to use a pedagogy that's full of pauses and ease that they will never encounter in their professional lives? And honestly, that's a really, really important, valid question. So one of the things that I might approach, like, let's say someone asked me that exact question. Well, I'm an NP and I teach nurses, and we have to do memorization. We have to operate in chaos. We cannot fuck up. And we have to move fast. I might begin with just looping back to the point that the principles I'm suggesting aren't saying do it slow or do it fast. They aren't saying do it easy or do it hard. They're saying assess the situation and think about what would be accessible, what would foster learning in this particular setting. So another way that one could do a collaborative exercise, instead of saying, let's design an accessible activity together, would be to say, let's work together on how to do something fast and right the first time. That is hard. And it requires creativity and it requires group input and play. So that's something that I would work with people on. In terms of the question of fakery, which is one I get pretty often, depending on the circumstance, I might offer statistics. It is so difficult to get disability accommodations in higher education, and it is so difficult to sustain them without having to be constantly recertified and constantly shamed. The level of people faking this system is much lower than popular discourse would suggest. Applying for accommodation sucks. It just sucks. It even sucks as a faculty member. It's just not a recipe for success if someone is looking for the easy way out. And in terms of thinking about whether students are quote unquote gaming the system, sometimes I will just sidestep that question. Why wouldn't they? Look at the world they're operating in. Look at the world we are operating in as faculty. And I will try to shift focus, not only in a class I'm teaching, but also in teacher trainings or just in conversations with colleagues, again, to the present situation. What is it that you want to accomplish? Let's just assume that some people will be doing kind of whatever they want or gaming the system. I personally can't control that. I want to work with the people who are building a better world with me. Looks like we have one more minute. If there are any questions or closing comments people would like to offer. All right. Well, I think Amy had to drop off. Is Courtney still here? Yay. Okay. So
Yep.
I'm just going to stay on the call in case there are follow-up questions. But Courtney, I'll let you bring us home.
Yep. All right. Thank you for everyone who stuck with us through the entire time. As I said, this is being recorded, so it will be uploaded onto the Dresser Center YouTube at a later date. And once it is, I will send it out to everyone. But just as a reminder, also a plug for the Disability Studies Working Group. If you want to have more conversations about these, you can reach out to Dresser Center and we'll put you in contact with the folks who run that group. And like Amy said at the beginning, if there are any other sort of professional development workshops similar to this or on other topics that you are interested in, again, we're more than happy to talk and see what we can do. And thank you to Margaret for sharing her time with us and her energy. And thanks to Sam for I guess allowing you to work in peace relatively.
He left. My partner came home, so now we just have Otis sleeping on the floor.
Okay. The cat's like, all right, I found
Yeah,
someone to keep me
I'm not
occupied.
interesting anymore.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, so we'll stay. If anyone wants to stick around, you can. Other than that, we will close everything out.
All
So
right.
thanks
Thank you
everyone.
so
Have a
much,
good day.
everyone. I really appreciate it. Drew, thanks for your great questions.
Oh yeah, no problem. So good to see you. I feel like it's been a long time.
It
So
has been a really long time. I know. I'm refraining from lots of shop talk like, oh, are you going to be at Four Cs?
yeah.
It's in
But yeah, I can
Cleveland.
email you about that.
Okay,
But
yeah, do.
yeah.
So folks who are still here, do you want to talk about anything or just check in or ask for anything?
Not really. I just wanted to say thank you for everything that you shared. I hope that we get more opportunities to talk about this.
Me as well,
I think
yeah.
that maybe I do want to know about like your experience directing a minor. I mean a program in disability studies. I'm the director of the minor, and I think that most of what I do is a lot of like bureaucratic stuff, like trying to get people to even consider that this is a real field.
Yes.
So any suggestions you have will be very useful.
That's such a great question. I'm actually thinking of developing a separate training just for people administering disability studies majors and minors and potentially grad programs because it's so hard, like always under resourced. Getting buy-in is one of your biggest jobs all the time. And then once you have something that's working really well and rolling, this is what I'm experiencing right now. Your institution might kind of start using you as a cash cow, precisely because disability is now a big draw for students across all kinds of majors and professions. So I'm dealing with problems like classes that I designed for 40 students are now randomly having their caps raised to 60. An upper level undergraduate course that was supposed to be a small seminar course randomly now is capped at 40. And I have graduate students teaching that course. They're not getting extra compensation for doing that. And I didn't train them to teach a lecture style class, but somebody saw how high the enrollments were and they're like, oh, great, let's just keep pushing that up. So it is really frustrating. I try to be as vocal as I can about just how high the pressures are for an extremely